Hello and welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Helgo. We are on the reproductive system, chapter 23, part 5. We are talking about conception and disorders today. So after ejaculation into the vagina, the sperm swim to meet an ovum, and if it does occurs in the upper 1/3 of the uterine tube. And once the sperm enters the plasma membrane, the plasma membrane of the ovum changes and prevents other sperms from fertilizing it. And now we call that a zygote. And it makes its way down the uterine tubes, and by day 4, it is in the uterus. And if it is fertilized, it is becoming an embryo. And day 6, 7, 8, 9, roughly, the embryo will implant into the endometrial layer, into the endometrium, and the placenta will start growing. It is not complete until the 4th month. This takes the whole first trimester and takes a lot of energy, and there's also a lot of hormones going on, and the female doesn't always feel good from all those different hormones. So gestational period is 266 days, roughly, or 38 weeks, but why do we say a pregnancy is 40 weeks? Well, we always count the 2 weeks before conception because it's easier to know the start of a period than it is to know when conception occurred. So that adds up to a total of 40 weeks. Okay, looking at the picture, at ovulation, we know an ovum is released from the ovary and it travels down the uterine tubes, and then in the uterine tubes it will be fertilized. If that happens, it becomes a zygote, and then it divides by mitosis and divides by mitosis again, and in about 3 days you get a morula, which is a ball of cells, and then a blastocyst, which is a hollow ball of cells. And then by about 6 days, it makes its way to the uterus and will implant in the lining, the endometrium lining there. And it has become a trypoblast, and it's already starting to form those 3 tissue layers that will form all of the layers in your body, all of the tissues in your body. Okay, let's talk about disorders. What could possibly go wrong? So a hernia is the protrusion of an organ through the wall of its cavity. And there are many different types, and not all of them deal with the reproductive system, and both men and women can get hernias. So let's talk about inguinal hernias. These are quite common, and they are more common in men. So taking a look at the picture, we have an inguinal hernia, a direct hernia, umbilical hernia. A lot of times they are labeled for where they are. So inguinal hernias happen often in men. They would happen in the inguinal canal, which was important during the fetus when the testicles dropped into the scrotum before birth. So then the inguinal canal was covered up with connective tissue, but this still represents a weak area of the abdominal wall. And sometimes a little bit of intestine can slip through the inguinal canal. So as you see, this is where the testes dropped in the fetus into the scrotum, and then this gets covered up with connective tissue, and every once in a while there's a weak spot and a little bit of intestines can slip through. How would you know if you had a hernia? Well, if there is a soft lump or a bulge in the groin, your lower abdomen, and there is pain there, that is a good indication that that is a hernia. So how would we treat it? Watchful waiting means watching it and being careful with it and seeing what happens, if it gets worse or if it gets better. Manual pressure would mean basically pushing it back in. Pain medications to deal with pain, and then if those don't work, surgery to repair that. There are some possible complications from an inguinal hernia or any hernia. An incarcerated hernia is where the intestines become obstructed and the food cannot go through the intestines. This leads to constipation. or strangulation hernia. That is when blood flow is cut off to the intestines, and this is a serious condition because that tissue can die, and we do not want that to happen. So a second disorder is endometriosis, and inguinal hernias were more common in men, and this is not just more common in women, it does not happen in men because men do not have an endometrium. As remember, that is the tissue that grows inside of the uterus, and in endometriosis, the endometrial tissue is actually growing outside of the uterus. So it can grow in a couple of places, on the ovaries, on the intestines, on any of the tissue lining the pelvis, like any of the connective tissue, and actually it can grow anywhere. I was talking to someone, a doctor, who said they had a patient who had endometrial tissue growing in like the nose of their patient. So what? This displaced endometrial tissue, it will thicken, break down, and bleed just like the endometrial tissue in the uterus with each menstrual cycle. That does cause some problems because the displaced tissue and the blood has no way to exit the body, so it becomes trapped, and it will irritate that surrounding tissue. That may develop scar tissue, and it might bind organs together. So some complications with this is that it can cause pain during the period, and it can cause fertility problems. So this affects about 6 to 10% of women, so it does affect quite a few women. Symptoms: how would you know if you have endometriosis? There is recurring pelvic pain, and infertility are some of the most common symptoms. A lot of times it is asymptomatic. Treatment: how does one treat endometriosis? So there is actually no cure for this. So if you have endometriosis, it will continue all the way up through menopause. And for the pain, there's pain medications, and hormones like birth control can help make it so that endometriosis doesn't get worse. And surgery is another option, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So we look here at the picture, we have our uterus, and then we have the endometrial tissue growing on the uterus, the uterine tubes, and the ovaries. So I have a friend who has endometriosis, and she was kind enough, and she had endometriosis surgery, and she was kind enough to let us look at the pictures that were taken during the surgery. So they actually go in and make several cuts at the lower abdominal wall, and bring in a laser, a scope with a laser on it and a light, and they blow up the abdomen with air, with CO2 gas, so that there's a lot of room to work. So in here, you can see looking superiorly, we're looking at the liver, and there's the gallbladder. This yellow stuff would be some abdominal fat. Coming over here, these are the intestines, and this is the appendix. And now looking down, we are looking at the bladder and the uterus. So coming over here, this is the uterus and the right ovary and the right uterine tube. As you can see, there is some endometriosis here, and that the ovary is actually adhered to the wall of the uterus. And then over here is the left ovary. As you can see, it is also adhered to the wall of the uterus. And actually, over here is another adherence, and the abdominal wall from the back is actually adhered to the uterus. So that's causing some pain and problems there. And then here again, the left uterine tube and the left ovary. So here are pictures during the surgery. Here is the left ovary, and it has been freed from the uterus. And then these are circled, are layers of endometriosis. And as you can see, here's endometriosis on the ovary. And then this is a nice picture of the uterine tube with the fimbriae. And over here, there is the uterus and the ovary, and that has those dark areas where the lasers actually burned the endometriosis off. And again here, and then near the end of the surgery, they sent blue dye through the uterine tubes to make sure that they were clear. And in this picture, we also are looking at the blue dye coming through the uterine tubes just to make sure that they are unobstructed. Picture of the uterus and the two ovaries with the endometriosis burned off with a laser. And you can see that the ovaries are not adhered to the uterus anymore. And then what they do is they wrap everything with this gauze that will break down naturally in about a month, but that's supposed to help so that the adhesions and scar tissue doesn't form. They tucked everything back in, and as you can see, this is what a uterus and the ovaries tucked in there in the abdominal wall would look like. So my friend, after this surgery, did get rid of some of the pain, which was great. So that was great that she was able to share that with us. Okay, fibroids. Sylvia, what's going on with Sylvia? We're going to have to figure that out during class. And fibroids are also called uterine myomas. If we look at this word, myoma, we know it's a tumor of the muscle. So these are firm, compact tumors made of smooth muscle and connective tissue, and they will develop in the uterus. They are often small and benign, which means they are not cancerous, and they develop anytime between puberty and menopause. They are very common. They will happen in about 50% of the women will at one time have a fibroid, and a lot of times you don't know that, and it just goes away on its own. So what symptoms would you have if you had fibroids? Usually they are asymptomatic, but they can cause pain. There also are some possible complications. It can interfere with pregnancy, or they can cause blood hemorrhages. And how would we treat them? Suppress the growth of the fibroids with hormones, or actually go in with surgery and remove. So our final group of disorders are sexually transmitted diseases. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about them because you should have done this in health class already. I do expect that you know all of these and know about them, and we'll talk about them in class. Chlamydia, gonorrhea, genital herpes, genital warts, syphilis, HIV, and HPV. Also, a disturbing fact is that 1 in 2 or 50% of sexually active young people will get an STD by the age of 25, and many of those people will not know that they have it. So here are some possible questions you might have, and if you have questions, we can talk about that in class. But it is important to get tested for STDs. Now, they are sometimes asymptomatic, and also if you are interested in having sex with someone, you have the right to have them be tested before the two of you are sexually active. Thus concludes our reproductive system, and that's all actually for all of our anatomy and physiology notes. Thank you and goodbye.